Morning. It is now 4 minutes after the hour of 8 o'clock in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and across the Eastern Caribbean. Welcome to Iron Soufriere, the morning edition. I'm pleased to have in studio with me this morning Minister of Education and National Reconciliation, the Honourable Curtis King. We'll be joined via Zoom by lead scientist monitoring the Soufriere volcano, Professor Richard Robertson. Gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to the studios of NBC.
Good morning, Diane.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning, Professor.
Good morning. Good morning.
All right, so we're happy to have everyone, and this program is very much look forward to, and we're going to turn straight to you, Professor. We usually start by recapping the events from the day before, and then we speak about what's happening for this brand new day.
Right, so seismic activity at Soufriere essentially continued the pattern that it had established after the explosive activity on the 18th of April. Which means we continue since then to have small, long period and hybrid earthquakes, earthquakes that are not likely to be felt. These continue to be recorded. And we have had 2 rock falls also over the period since last time I gave an update. We have had no VTs or tremor for the last 12 hours. One of perhaps the most significant things that happened during the period was that we got what's called a lahar or mud flow signal at around 4 o'clock this morning. It was recorded at the station in Bamboo Range, which suggests to us that a lahar or mud flow came down the river, one of those rivers on the southeast. I suspect it might be Rabaka. And that's why we picked up the signal. The lahar is really like a thick, muddy river. You have a lot of deposits up at the summit, and we'd expect that as rains come, as we get into the rainy season, whatever else happens at the volcano, one of the hazards that's going to become more pronounced and more likely are mud flows. You're going to have flooding of lower areas. It's going to damage houses and probably bridges and things like that. So there was one early this morning, and in the station at Bamboo Range, and it's likely that it might have been in Rabaka. So activity continues more or less in that kind of vein. If it continues, we'd expect that at some point within the next 7 days or so, we probably have another explosion. As we've said before, the volcano seems to be trying, in a sense, to grow a dome, and it doesn't succeed because it then has an explosion that gets destroys that dome. We'd expect at some point it might actually succeed, and you may have a dome there. We don't know if this week is the time that it happens, but if it doesn't, well, you're probably going to have an explosion. So activity essentially continues the same, with now us having mud flows.
When you speak of a rockfall, Professor, if you can just explain what this encapsulates.
Yeah, well, actually, that's interesting, because one of the ways in which we, apart from this signal that we have, the long period and the hybrid event, which are usually indicative of magma moving, and usually it's associated with a possible period of dome growth that happens. We've seen it in Montserrat. Our seismologists say Rod Stewart have seen it, and others at the MP have seen things like that. One of the other sort of ways in which tells us that probably this is true is actually the rock falls, because it's likely that as the dome grows, bits and pieces of it fall off, and it generates a signal that we have on a rockfall. That's possibly one of the reasons you get rockfall. A rockfall signal is essentially a seismic signal that's generated when a large mass of a large part, a large rock, a large piece of volcanic material fall off the mountain and move down the mountainside. And as it does that, it generates a vibration that the seismic instruments record. So it's possible to have them anywhere in a volcano that's not necessarily related to dome growth, but the fact that you're having them and you begin to have a few more suggests to us that it probably is another indicator that you probably have the volcano either growing or trying to, well, you have some sort of growth going on at the summit, and that is a result of it, quite apart from the seismic signals that we have.
And the possible impact of lahars?
Right. So any of the river valleys that you have on the volcano is going to be potentially impacted by lahars, because essentially they're just a river that's come down, as we say in Soufriere, the river come down. And in this case, when the river come down, the river bring in all the blocks and pieces of vegetation and everything that the volcano has destroyed at the summit and just resting in the ground. When the rain falls, it carries it into the river. So the river has a lot more potential to cause damage because it has a lot more material in it. It's not just water alone. It has a lot more, bits and pieces of things that could push things and do damage. So lahars are much more dangerous potentially than just simply a swollen river or river in flood. It's a river in flood, but a river in flood that has a lot more material in it. So any of the valleys that drain the volcano, we won't be surprised if you have that happening as we move forward and we move into the rainy season. And if and when that happens, we won't be surprised if it causes damage to any structures anywhere close to the river valley or anywhere in the river valley itself. So we're talking about, Rabaka, all of those on the volcano, but also those south. If there are any places that had a lot of ash, when the rain falls, all of that ash is going to come off and go into the drainage system, go into the rivers, and they potentially could cause some element of damage. So that's kind of a secondary effect that you have from volcanoes when they erupt. That is something that is likely to happen. I would expect that the most significant damage is going to be probably on the volcano itself, because you have larger bits of material, because you have larger blocks and fragments of rock. You have trees that have been killed. You're going to have more of that on the volcano itself. But even as you come south, in some of the river valleys, you have had a lot of ash. So you're going to have sort of a river that potentially has more material in it to cause damage. So it's something that we have to look and be aware of. So, for example, if you are still anywhere in those areas, if you are going to the areas where the road crosses the river, the valley, if you have to go into any valley, don't be surprised. I mean, you have to be aware if rain was falling up in the mountain, you have to be conscious that you could have a lahar. So if you're going into an area where you have a valley or river valley, you have to be a little bit more aware of the potential for this kind of hazard to happen now, because we have so much material on the land.
Good morning again, Professor Robertson.
Good morning, Minister.
Yes, let me once again thank you and your team for the wonderful work you have been doing and helping to keep us relatively safe. You said earlier that perhaps within the next 7 days, you would expect an explosive eruption. I was just looking at the trends. Earlier, it was roughly between 12 to 14 hours.
Right.
And then we had a long lull, some 40 or 41 hours elapsed before we had any explosive eruption. Have you seen a significant shift away from the earlier trends with regards to the explosive eruption?
Right. It's the pattern generally is that the time period is increasing. There's some element of a sort of a pattern we don't quite get handle on, but essentially the main thing is that the gap in between the explosive events and the relatively quiet periods is increasing. So it went from 13 to 40 something to 50 something. So and it probably will get to 70 and 80. We're not quite sure if there's a rate or special relationship with how fast the gap is increasing, but we know that the gap is increasing. That's why I said there's a potential for it. But I also said that there is also potential that it might not happen, that this time the dome might be successful in being formed, in which case the chances of it capping the system, at least for a longer time, would be there. And you might, instead of having the explosion, you might have validation that you actually have a dome there. And then it may take a little bit longer, because then it has more material to get out of the way if it's going to go explosive.
Professor, I ask that because I think we have to reinforce the point that whenever there's a lull, it does not mean that activities somehow have come to an end. And therefore it is important that persons stay away from the danger zone, because persons are always tempted to return home for whatever reasons. And we can see what could happen if during one of those so-called laws, you went back to the danger zone and then there's an eruption.
Right. I agree with you completely. And I think the first thing I'd say is that the volcano hasn't stopped erupting yet, and that everywhere in the red zone is extremely dangerous, even during these lulls, because we don't know how long the lulls are going to be. The pattern seems to be like that now, but the volcano has shown that it can change its pattern within minutes without any other indication. Once volcanoes are erupting as they are now, and once they've shown that they have a potential to be explosive and could be dangerously and violently explosive, as this one has shown, it really makes sense for you to stay away from them. Even if it looks now like there are periods when there's very little happening. Because, as I said again, even though it looks like it's increasing and that, as I said, the chances of something happening is within a certain time frame, that is with the current pattern. The pattern could change before I finish speaking, and then it suddenly you have a different thing. So that's why it's particularly because of the what we call the uncertainty. There's a certain element that we know that, but there's a lot happening at the volcano that we don't quite understand or know, and therefore we give as best we can projections about what could happen, but we can't be absolutely certain. And in that regard, it means therefore that people need to be very careful, need to be conscious that red, is still dangerous, and that the fact that you have this apparent, periods when you have quiescence or it not doing very much, it doesn't mean, at least at the surface, it's not doing very much on the surface, but we have another shaking going on. That's what we have in the earthquakes. So it's doing a lot. It's trying to get out, and we don't know exactly when it will get out, even though it looks like it has a pattern. So I agree with you, don't be fooled. It's been shown from studies that these are the periods when people are most at risk, and the chances of people being killed are most. When the volcano goes into this sort of pattern where it looks like it's not doing very much, people tend to drop their guard, and then they do things that they shouldn't be doing, and they get caught out, even though they have been evacuated before. So again, it's just to reinforce what you said. There might be that certain activities have to happen, in certain areas that are at high risk, but you need to make sure you do them in a particular way. So, you scientists might have to, we who monitor might have to go and do something in the volcano, but when we do it, there's a set of measures we take. And if you're not doing that, then it increases your chance of something bad happening. So again, it reinforces the point that the general public, kind of anybody just going in just because it looks quiet, that's a bad idea.
Go
Okay,
ahead, Minister.
yes.
Go ahead.
Professor, now persons are more or less going, quote-unquote, sightseeing, okay? When there's a explosive eruption, persons are moving into certain vantage points, which are, in many respects, in the danger zone, whether red or orange, so that they can take pictures and so on. But we have been told that a number of times when you have fatalities, it has more to do with the pyroclastic flow. I speak now about the windward side of the island, the eastern side, where we have the Rabakajai River. Is it possible that you would have pyroclastic flows in that vicinity? And as such, it is, of course, dangerous for persons to be in that area doing taking their pictures and so on during an eruption.
Right. Now, there's no reason why people can't safely see the volcano when it's doing spectacular things like explosions and be safe. Unsafe, sorry. There are places, there are lots of vantage points. You don't have to go to Rabaka to do that. There are lots of vantage points on high places that you could go and you could set up. If you want to do that, you could take a picture. There are lots of places on the windward and the leeward side. Rabaka, it's a bad idea, extremely bad, because Rabaka is one of the primary paths for pyroclastic flows to come down. It's also a pathway by which lahars come down. And lahars are not necessarily, if they're big enough, going to be confined to that valley that you see there, that is under the bridge where you have the Rabaka. A proper lahar comes down. It doesn't need a paraclastic flow to do that. We'll take out all of that and take out the sides, and the Rabaka will re-establish its full extent. And for people, the Rabaka doesn't start at where you see the start of the road at the bridge. The Rabaka starts all the way back, about 200 or 300 meters. So it's very wide. So when you think you're standing on the side of the Rabaka, you're actually in the Rabaka,
inside,
right? So you need to understand that, right? And if you're in the Rabaka, first of all, a mud flow could take you out. And if the mud flow then didn't do the damage, if it's in eruption, if it then goes into explosive eruption, you're caught in a mud flow. A pyroclastic flow could come down, and then that will finish you. Why I say it can come down is because we have seen in past explosive activity, certainly one on the 13th, that we could see that pyroclastic flows have come down the upper parts of the Rabaka. And how the pyroclastic flows work is that they, in a sense, when they come down a valley, the valley is deep, but and a lot of deposits go through the valley and go further down, and it's deposited. But some of it is deposited in the valley, upper parts of the valley, so that after a while, after a few flows go down, there is no more a valley. There's just a flat space. And pyroclastic flows, in which are formed from this volcano and from others, like that love that flat plane because it gives them less friction to move further. So it means that while the first set of flows might not reach the Rabaka, end of the Rabaka, and reach the river, and we hope really because of the impact that it would have on Sinus, it never does. As it is now, I would not be surprised if the next pyroclastic flow that comes down in that direction gets to the sea, because I think the upper parts of the Rabaka have already been filled in. So again, it makes the point that that place is extremely dangerous. There are places that you could go, for example, several high points before you get to the Rabaka that you could go and you could see the volcano erupting safely without being potentially affected by pyroclastic flows or now lahars, which is a problem. That you could see the plume, that you might have ash, but that's the main thing that you'd have. You're probably out of the way of the big blocks and fragments of rock that could fall at you. Lahar is a place that you could have pyroclastic flows and surges. You could have lahars. You could have fragments of rock that could hurt you, that could fall on your head. You haven't done that yet, but you could do that. So it's not a place that you should go for sightseeing. There are lots of other places that you could go safely. I'll suggest to you that you could record the land, find them, so that you know where to go, that you could still see the volcano, still see the spectacular views
but from a
that you
safe
want
distance.
to get,
Yes.
and don't be harmed.
One more question before Dion comes in. With regards to Mount Pile in yes, Martinique, and our own volcano. In 1902, they both had explosive eruptions. And earlier, well, during last year, we heard activities were happening there and St. Vincent. Is there any link as such that we know of between these two volcanoes?
Yeah, well, it's something that people say all the time, and I hope and trust that this time around, because Soufriere has erupted and nothing erupted have happened at Martinique in Montpellier, that people dispel that. It's not connected in the sense that people are thinking, that it is there's a physical connection between one volcano and another. But the process that forms Martinique, that formed Martinique, in fact, the island, and that causes it to have volcanoes, is the same process that has caused St. Vincent to have volcanoes. And in that sense, they are both related to the same earth process that created volcanism in this region. So in that sense, they are related, but they're not connected. So it would be surprising if one volcano causes another. It would not be surprising, though, if one volcano erupts around the same time as another. That's just a coincidence. That's not a link because of one causing the other. That's not a cause, what we call a causal link. It's not a link between the two volcanoes. It's a myth that people have, I think, that came back from 1902 when they both erupted around the same time. Hopefully this time around, 2020, 2021, they both haven't. So maybe that will dispel that belief that people have, that they're connected.
Okay, Professor, we've got several questions from regional and international viewers and listeners. What is the likely risk of ash affecting the Western Caribbean, example, Jamaica, Haiti, Cuba?
Right. It's likely that fine ash would get there. I'd be surprised if it's sufficient ash to cause kind of impact that you have in St. Vincent or in Barbados or in closer territories. The fine ash from volcanoes really get everywhere once there's enough volume, that once the winds are right. Once they get up into the upper atmosphere, they just basically circle the globe. And if you have enough of it, its potential to cause impact increases. If people think of fallout, that's probably not going to be the case in terms of ash falling. It's probably going to be the effect of the ash in terms of it's blocking out the sun rays. And in the case of the amount of ash we've put into the atmosphere from Soufriere, that's probably not going to be very much. But yet, the ash can get much farther afield and can get to Jamaica and places like that. The ash from 1902 got those kinds of areas. It got to South America and places like that. But it's not going to be, it shouldn't have that great an effect because we don't have an eruption that's producing, well, enough ash, essentially. If we had the kind of activity as when it started, going on for a couple of weeks or a couple of days longer, you probably could be thinking of that, but not for what we had.
CNN carried a report sometime, and I think it's as early as yesterday. And
Yeah.
I'm trying to just get back that question for you, stating that sulfur dioxide from our volcano was detected in India. They also mentioned the possibility of acid rain resulting from the gas mixing with the rain. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's you could track. They're correct that the SO2 has gone fairly wide, and there is indication that it got to India. Yes, and it probably would go further afield and circle the globe and that kind of thing. That's what it does because it's fine particles, it's gas that gets caught up in the upper atmosphere, and they basically go where the wind take them. Acid rain is always an issue with volcanoes because they put a lot of sulfur and oxide compounds in the atmosphere, potential things that could become acidic. Remember the same reason we had the burning of the vegetation here, essentially the same effect. In that case, it was a plume going down slope and hugging the ground and affecting the vegetation. In this case, if you put the same thing up into the atmosphere, it mixes with the moisture, it falls back down as acid rain. We don't seem to have had a big problem of that in this eruption so far in St. Vincent or in either place. But it is something that's known to have happened. In Montserrat, they had some of that when they had their eruptions. And therefore, it wouldn't be surprising if you have that here. In terms of how much it would affect and what impact it would have, I think it depends on the amount of particles that's put up there and where the wind takes them and whether you have rain at the time. We, in a sense, we wanted rain, but we didn't really have very much rain from our explosions. So the ash just went out further afield, and when it fell on the ground, it didn't fall as rain. It just fell as ash. And yes, if you mix water to that, you'll have a dilute acid. So it is a problem, but it wasn't, and it could become a problem in the future.
A question for you, Professor, but I think this one is more bordering on the line of a concern. Persons returning to the affected areas and cleaning without being adequately prepared as it relates to the appropriate gear. This also applies to journalists who are driving through these areas without proper masks and coverings of their body. This is a submission from UWI TV View. I'm not too sure if you want to.
I mean, I think I'll make the comment that really, if you're moving around in areas that have a lot of ash, you really should protect your breathing passages from and the openings in your body from getting that ash into your system. It's not good for you generally. I mean, you're not going to be I don't think unless you're vulnerable to have particular respiratory problems, you're not going to become sick from it immediately. But if you're doing it over a period of time, it could have a potential long-term effect if you're exposing yourself to it. And generally, it's just bad for you to ingest so much fine particles into your lungs. So it's a good idea if you're cleaning roofs, if you're cleaning your house, that you put on a mask that would protect you from that remobilized material getting into your system. It's just generally not a good idea to have that in your system and to have it there. It's coming from a volcano. It might be slightly acidic. And the particles, the volcanic particles, are very tough. You know, they're very corrosive potentially. And if you see the impact that they have on man-made structures, you could imagine the kind of damage that it would have internally. As I said, it's probably not going to kill you, but it could cause your system inside to have some has negative effects in it. So it makes sense. Put on the mask, just like you have to put on the mask for COVID. Put on the mask for the ash.
I know that you have to go, so I'm going to make this my final questions. The others I'd ask you tomorrow. About half an hour before the eruption on Sunday, this person is commenting that their dogs started howling continuously. And they from as a result of that, they said to someone that there's going to be an eruption. The howling also came on the Thursday before the first explosion, and they've detected that each time thereafter, the dogs howl, and then there is an eruption. Care to comment on that, Professor? Is that a sign?
Well, I mean, I'm not I tend to stay in my corner, but I'll say that it's not the first time we've had those kinds of reports.
Like the fishes.
Yeah, right. So I mean, people have always said that. Now, whether or not there's a science connection, I can't say, but just to say that we didn't get, the signals that we had went from, I mean, you could look at it physically, it went from almost flatline to just bang. So there wasn't any vibration of the ground, certainly, in a different way than it was vibrating before the event happened. If animals or if anybody has to feel something before the event, there has to be something has changed. It's possible that something's changed and we're simply not detecting it. So it's possible that, the animals are feeling some vibrations or detecting something that we're not. But we can't, we don't know that for sure. And I haven't seen any real validated science that says that it does. And I can't discount it because I don't know enough about it.
Okay. Minister, any more questions?
Yes, just one final one, Professor. Given that the violent and explosive eruption has destroyed most of your instruments in and around the volcano at that close point, what are you using now? What is the reliance?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't. We actually have been more fortunate, I think, than we probably would have anticipated. When you monitor a volcano, you tend to put out, in a sense, more stations that you probably could survive with in terms of really need for monitoring because you expect some of them to be damaged. In our case, we have lost 3, but I don't think we have lost all of them in the sense that they've been physically damaged. I think in terms of these seismic instruments, we've probably lost definitely 1 that's on the summit.
Okay.
I think the other 2 that we don't have a signal from is more because of power issues. So the instrument is probably still there and working, but we can't get the data in because there isn't any power at the site that communicate the site that is used for communicating the signal to us. The only really other instrument that we had at the summit, which was the reflector that was looking at if the dome was pressing against the wall and it could be compromised, and also a camera. Yeah, we know that's damaged and destroyed. We expected that, but the reason that was put there was first of all to monitor the dome, which is no more, and secondly, it was to monitor for the flank of the volcano potentially getting compromised or failing because of the dome. So in a sense, we have lost them, but we don't really need them anymore because we don't have a dome anymore and we have a volcano that is exploding. So the main thing that we need, the main instruments that we need, the seismic instruments, the GPS instruments, and the gas, all of which are still functioning. So in terms of being able to give us what we need to know what's happening, I think we still, okay, of course, we'll, of course, put in additional instruments as we get a chance to augment that so that if something happens in the future, we're still here. But so far, we have enough to allow us to know what's happening.
Wonderful.
Well, Professor, let me thank you so much, as usual, for your discussion and your answers this morning. All things being well, God's willing, we'll be back with you tomorrow morning on another Spotlight.
Right. Can I just say something
Sure.
at the end? Just, I just wanted to thank a couple of people. Well, you know, we don't, I keep making the point that I'm just the face of an operation that's much bigger than I am.
Of course.
But in addition to Seismic and the staff at Seismic at Montserrat and places like that, there are other agencies that have assisted and have continued to assist this agency in doing what we want. There's the Volcano Disasters Assistance Program of the USGS that helped in stations, putting in stations that we actually have in a volcano currently erupting, currently monitoring. There's CRIF, which have provided funding for some of the instruments. There's Digicel that assisted us with communications. There's actually, I'll say there was 2 members of our staff took a 3-day journey on a tugboat from Dominica to get here.
Wow.
And yes, and after time, the tugboat captain and the 2 guys, in fact, who took that journey with all my dedication to get here. That brought Ilyas Papadopoulos, Dr. who you meet later on, and Avid, a technical person. And I've mentioned Braxa again. Braxa has been tremendously helpful in getting us there. And finally, is the Coast Guard. The reason that we could do gas now is because of the Coast Guard. They allow Dr. Christopher to go on the boat to do the traverses, and we now have a better idea of the gas output, and that's going to be critical as we continue to measure them in terms of how things change. So there's a lot of people we have to thank, and from now on, I'm going to try to make sure I get through a long list of people, apart from Seismic staff, who have helped us to do what we're doing currently. I just want to say thank you very much. And, you know, thanks to Vincentians who listen to us and making sensible decisions. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. We will always provide the platform for you to do that, and we appreciate what you continue to do for us here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The world is looking on, and when the science comes from you, the science is good science.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much,
Yeah,
Professor. Minister, we're going to continue our program now as we talk education and the implications, no doubt, from the La Soufriere volcano and the COVID, of course, from COVID straight into the eruptions of La Soufriere.
Yes, well, Dion, when we look at the impact of the multiplicity of challenges that we have had on education, we are in a situation where our students have experienced significant learning loss. And we need to make the point that, yes, we had COVID-19, but don't forget, we also had the challenge associated with the spread of dengue fever. People forget that dengue fever actually resulted in the death of 8 persons. And up until school was closed, and even when we were planning for the reopening of schools, the dengue fever protocols were still in place. Additionally, we also have the annual hurricane season, and that is fast approaching. So that there are many challenges, and education has suffered a great blow. Now, we, however, as a government, as a people, we cannot just throw our hands up in the air. We have to do something to limit the negative impact of these challenges on our education system. And the Ministry of Education is charged with that responsibility to come up with programs, proposals to deal with the issue. We have been doing so. We have had several meetings. These meetings basically have looked at 2 major issues. That of how we can assist persons psychosocially and what we can do to help to recover some of our academic loss in terms of instruction and so on. Because I need to remind persons that all of our schools basically are out of commission. They are either being used as shelters for persons who were removed or who evacuated from the danger zones, and in some instances from the orange zone too. And those schools that are in those danger zones, red and orange, of course they have been abandoned because persons are not there. So that school has remained closed for quite a long time. In fact, when the volcano erupted, or started erupting on Friday, 9th April, school was actually rescheduled to be open on the 12th of April, so that school should have been open on Monday, the 12th. Unfortunately, the eruption happened and we had to once again defer face-to-face instruction. Now, this have significant implications for the broad education system, yes, but an immediate factor is that of the annual examinations that we have. And I'm speaking more so of the external exams. The CPEA, Caribbean Primary Exit Assessment, which replaces the Common Entrance exam. And that exam is crucial in terms of placing persons at secondary school. Now we have universal access so that everyone will go on to a secondary school. However, the issue is the placement of these students, and that is a significant factor. And even as we speak, we have not yet resolved how we are going to deal with that. Discussions are continuing. With regards to the CSEC, that is to say, the Caribbean certificate that you would gain for secondary school students, that those exams also are around this period and should have started in April and run up to June. Several discussions with CXC, we have ultimately, and this as a region, postponed those exams to at least a month later, and some other issues relating to students' level of comfort. That is to say, you release the questions to the students 5 weeks in advance of the exams and so on and so on. But in the case of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, that package that was offered by CXC has to be reevaluated, because at the time the package was offered, not just for St. Vincent and the Grenadines, but to the entire region, the situation was not that bleak in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So as such, we have been engaging CXC in discussions as to how best we can resolve this so that our students would not be at a further disadvantage. In fact, we have a meeting scheduled today with the CXC, which I myself would be involved in, and the top management, people in the Ministry of Education, as well as some other stakeholders. But the whole issue is trying to arrive at an amicable solution that would not be to the disadvantage of our students with regards to the CXC CSEC examinations. Because rightfully, stakeholders, parents, principals, teachers, students are anxious. But as I said in an earlier release sometime last week, that we need not be overly anxious because we are dealing with the issue, and whatever decision we are going to arrive at will take into consideration the circumstances in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The other exam is that of CAPE. which is basically the advanced proficiency program, which is done by the community college, and which is also administered by CXC. Now, we have been talking to the director, Mr. Scott, and like the other students, we see the same trend. And whereas I would say the year ones, those who are doing the unit one in the Cape program, while they might not be so challenged as the other students because they had continued work, while they might not be so challenged, certainly those who are doing the unit 2 part of the program, they're in the same predicament as the other students. And the associate degree program too, those students are also in a serious predicament. So we are discussing all of these issues so that at the end of the day, we would arrive at an amicable solution. Hopefully, the issues relating to, I come back to the CPA, again, we would have discussions with all concerns so that we could work out something that persons would not say that somehow the Ministry of Education is engaged in any sort of discrimination. I mean, that is a national issue that is very sensitive because, as we know, under our system, the first 500 students, the top 500 students, they are basically offered places based on their choice, their choices. And as such, without the exams, if that is going to be the case, then we must have some workable solution that would be accepted by most persons. I say most persons because I don't think everybody is going to accept whatever formula we arrived at, if that becomes the case. But I speak in this way, Dion, because when we look at what is happening, the fact that the schools are all being utilized or abandoned, the fact that students have not, across the different levels, have not yet completed their syllabus, the content needed to really give off their best in the examination. Added to that, the SBAs, the school-based assessment that students do at all the levels, they have not yet completed. So that is a challenge. And when we add to that the psychological frame of mind of our students, I mean, in this situation, persons are not in the best condition to focus on exams, and more so to be very successful at examinations. And in any event, these exams are very crucial to the onward journey or to the continued journey of our students in their educational pursuits. So these are issues that we have to treat with great level of seriousness and ensure that we arrive at the decisions that would at least have most persons satisfied.
The interface with the teachers and the students, online classing at this moment, is any of that happening even at this time?
Well, not yet. Let me put it this way. At present, the Ministry of Education is focusing firstly on a program to engage those students who are now at shelters. And the first instance, we are looking at those students who are in public shelters. Then we have to engage those who are in private shelters with the broader community of students. Well, fortunately, as we had indicated, quite early, as early as last year, in order to make the online mode of instruction successful, that we had to provide certain infrastructure. We have been working with the telecommunication companies, and we have had fairly good responses. One of the major issues, though, had to do with the lack of devices, especially among the primary school students. You would recall that we had distributed earlier 17,000 tablets to all the secondary school students and all the teachers at the secondary school and primary school levels. We had also distributed tablets to all the grade 6 in the primary schools, as well as all the grade 5s, with the exception of those schools in Kingston. So I'm happy to report now that we now have the other tablets. We received 6,000 tablets earlier this week, which would be distributed to the students from grade 4, 3, 2, 1, and I believe the grade Ks. Okay? So at least we have in place now the infrastructure to allow for greater success in the online teaching program. So we are hoping to capitalize on that. But as I'm saying, we are approaching it step by step. We want to first engage those students in the shelter because they are the ones with immediate needs, right? And then we move to the other levels. Of course, we have to continue to find ways of having the appropriate content in these digital programs, because you would recognize that online teaching, as useful as it is, and I keep making the point, it is not the most, well, let me put it this way, it cannot replace face-to-face instruction. And therefore, we have to do all that we can to make sure that the experience is one that is rewarding to the students. And of course, the teachers involved, but of course, more so the students.
Minister, to piggyback on the whole issue of the external exams, institutions offer scholarships to CPA students based on their performance. How would this be facilitated?
Well, as I'm saying, we are still discussing how best to deal with it. But regardless to what happens, their placement would be done on the basis of their performances. So again, that should not be a difficulty because you would still be able to rank the students based on their performances. Of course, if that is the case, we will be using records from both the schools and the Ministry of Education.
How would all of this affect the shelter management in terms of the assistance, as more schools are using their teachers in terms of the overall management of the shelters?
Good question, because I actually missed that. The fact is that the entire Ministry of Education is very much involved in the process of shelter management. And I put it this way, the PS, the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Education, he is the chairperson of the Shelter Management Committee. The Chief Education Officer is the Chief Shelter Manager. So when we move down to the other levels, the management of the shelters at the school level, that management is being done by teachers with the principals playing a supervisory role. So generally speaking, the Ministry of Education is engaged and intricately engaged in this whole process. Therefore, it is going to impact on our ability to deliver the online education. Nevertheless, we are coming up with a strategy because we do recognize that we can make certain adjustments that would allow teachers still to be engaged in online teaching, as well as the principals playing a role. But as I'm saying, we have not yet worked out the fine details. These are things that we are looking at.
Continues to be a work in
Yes.
progress. I know this is something you spoke to on several occasions, all students not being engaged in terms of the online classes for various reasons. Is there an improvement in the relationship now between the providers of the data internet platform and the Ministry of Education in ensuring that there's a more stable platform for these students to do their work?
Well, I would say before the explosive eruption of the volcano, we had seen significant progress. But like everyone else, we know that in this period, the service is not always the most reliable. And so we expect that would be a challenge. We are hoping, though, that as we progress, that things would improve. But certainly, we have seen a greater level of commitment from those providers, and where we had the challenge also of some homes without electricity, we have moved to that stage where we have provided that kind of service. We still have a lot to do, but I can safely say that before the eruption of the explosive eruption of the volcano, we had seen significant progress. Now, with students moving and so on, it would be a greater challenge. Now, take, for example, the shelters. The problem at the shelters, which in most parts are schools, is not that you don't have internet access. The problem is basically one of bandwidth, in that when you have a large number of persons accessing the internet, then you have significant interruption with the quality. Now, I know that the NTRC had mounted an initiative to increase the bandwidth at the larger secondary and larger primary schools. So they would have completed that project before the eruption. I hope that the shelters are still very much in a position where they could benefit from that. But again, these are things that we have to examine.
The teachers are intimately involved in the management of these
The
shelters.
shelters, yes.
I am assuming that there is now sort of a bit of a conflict in the sense, probably conflict is not the most appropriate word, but them being able to, being shelter managers and being able to teach. How are we going to deal with that?
Again, that is what I was saying, that we are looking at some options, okay? We are even thinking of having learning hubs in the different areas. But I'm saying again, it is a challenge in the sense that basically you have the same resources that would be earmarked to do several different things. And although we talk these days about multitasking, there are certain activities that would prove to be difficult to multitask. And certainly, as I'm saying, we are looking at how best we could maintain effective management of the shelters and yet still provide the education that these students need. I say this because we don't know how long the students will be in shelters. And you heard the scientists, not necessarily on today's program, but before, and you have heard policymakers talking about this, that who knows, we might definitely have to do some resettlement. I'm not saying that we are going to. I don't think I'm in a position to say that. But I'm saying if we are to look at what happened in the past, one time there was a serious hurricane in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and the people who are living in Sandy Bay had to be resettled. That is why we talk about old Sandy Bay and new Sandy Bay. Clearly, the destruction in those parts suggests that all the persons might not be able to return home. So the point I'm making, those shelters would be up and running perhaps for months, we don't know. So we have to take all of this into consideration when we are planning. Certainly, if they are going to be occupied for a long time, we cannot just decide that, oh, the shelters are in operation, so students should not be exposed to education. No, we have to come up with a strategy to deal with that. And in any event, even if we were to return to normal schooling, say by September, there's always going to be now on the way forward some level of remote learning. Yeah. And therefore, we have to continue to prepare our teachers for this eventuality.
Minister, something just occurred to me, and I see someone raised it. When families were being evacuated from the red zone, children had to be moved. Was there an assessment, or are we able to conduct an assessment to see how many of the children were able to, who received laptops and tablets, how many of them were able to actually, take that as take that with them when they evacuated?
Well, we just completed the process of getting that sort of information. I must commend the World Food Program for assisting us in this area. Yes, they have persons in telecommunication, and they were able to work with the Ministry of Education and develop an app that was used in the gathering of quite a significant amount of data from the shelters. So I am sure now that we are studying that data, and ultimately we would be in a position to give with fair accuracy the number of devices that are in the shelters, so that we could make a informed decision as to how we move forward with online or remote learning.
Our Ministry of Education prides itself, Minister, in the holistic development of its students. What about the psychosocial support that is being offered to the students at this most challenging time?
Okay, again, as I indicated, when the ministry sat down to look at how best to continue the education of the children, we divided it into two sections, basically, psychosocial and academic. And I know that the counselors, for example, they were called out. So counselors are deployed at schools, and they are providing that sort of support. Unfortunately, I can't speak to the program with great details, but I know that they are involved in providing that level of support to students and, where possible, some of the adults in the shelters also.
I know it's really a challenge, Minister, and I know I mean you this is your baby basically, and you know, things continue to unfold on a daily basis, because there is no script you can write for this. This is really an overwhelming situation. The way forward.
Well, I'm glad you made that point. Let me thank the team at the Ministry of Education, top management team, as well as the middle managers and other staff at the Ministry of Education, because although the ministry is new to me in terms of I being the person responsible to the cabinet, I've been in education, as you know, all my adult life. But the great thing is when you have a solid team to work with, it makes your task easier despite the challenges. So I want to thank the members of the Ministry of Education for their effort. I want also to thank the principals and teachers and other stakeholders for the understanding, because you might think that it is easily acceptable that we are in a crisis, and therefore persons would naturally gravitate towards an understanding that this is a crisis situation. But of course, a crisis does not mean that persons put their lives on hold. And as such, people are rightful in demanding that, look, there must be some level of continuity. So again, I want to thank all the stakeholders for their role. Some critical, but that is also important. But the general support has been generally overwhelming and good. Now, as to the way forward, as I indicated earlier, basically the ministry has set up, and boy, this is becoming so regular now. We had a task force set up to look at how to recover students' learning loss. We had a task force set up to discuss the return, the reopening of school for the 12th of April. And again, we have set up a next task force to look at how to continue the education of our students during this difficult period. And of course, we are still in the stages of fine-tuning that program. As I mentioned earlier, what I know the committee has done is basically to divide the student population into bands. So for example, you would have, let us say, grade K to about grade 2 in one band, grade 3 to grade 5 in the next band. The students who are doing exams, like the grade 6 and the Form 5s, they would be in another band, and so on. And what we are seeking to do is to organize the program in such a way that these students continue their education. Now, in the exam classes, the program obviously is more formal and more rigid, in the sense that we are still planning to meet whatever deadlines we ought to in the event that we have to, while at the same time exploring, as I indicated, discussions with like CXC to ensure that we work out something, another option, if you like. Now, with regards to the other bands of students, remember I said we have further divided those bands now into students who are at the shelter, students who are in private homes, and so on. And we are trying to develop an appropriate program to suit them. Now, I must make this point about the program. Clearly, the emphasis for those students who are not doing exams is basically going to be on providing them with the skills that they need to perform in the form that they would be promoted to. Not necessarily an emphasis on an exam so that you pass this exam to go forward. That is not going to be the emphasis for those in the non-exam classes, okay? Whereas, as I indicated, those in the exam classes, though, the approach is going to be more formal, and you're still basically preparing them for exam. So that is a major issue, and of course, allied to that is how we embark on learning recovery. And we had started that discussion, as I indicated before, We had support from the OECS, and we are continuing to look at that. Very importantly, again, this is a digital world, so we recognize that we need a digital platform that is appropriate to our own circumstances with the relevant content, if you like, so that we can reach our students and people. In other words, whatever platform we have should be of great benefit to our country in its present circumstance.
I know the way forward should have been my final question, but I now realize, Minister, that we focus solely on the impact on the education sector re the La Soufriere volcano.
Yes.
The COVID issue cannot be discounted because that is just as grave.
Yes.
But just one question as we look at the time frame for the reopening of school. How are we thinking of incorporating the protocols as it relates to COVID-19 as we think about face-to-face classroom settings, whenever that is possible? I mean, we have to think about it.
Yes, because I was going to say, I wish I was in the position to talk about the reopening of school for face-to-face instruction.
Yes.
I don't think in that position at all.
Yeah.
And in any event, we will always be guided by the Ministry of Health. So whatever the protocols are that the ministry adopts, we too will have to follow, as we have been doing. But I must say that I am paying very close attention to what is happening now, because you would recognize that we have quite a large number of persons in the schools. And fortunately, we have not heard of any significant spread of COVID-19 among the shelters. Although we have had reports, I think, of about two shelters. One, of course, is not a school. 2 or 3, but I know one is not a school. But certainly I'm following that issue, because you would recall that the issue of reopening school had more to do with providing a safe environment that persons who are returning would feel generally confident that the environment is one that is safe to return to. And we had to do a lot of work to get them up to that level. And now, before we could talk about reopening school, once the shelters are no longer in operation, then we would have to move back to that stage. I would say, though, that we have seen a lot of opportunities upon which to build. You would recall before the shelters were operated, quite a number of schools. In fact, the Ministry of Education had done a survey to assess the number of schools that would have been in readiness to serve as shelters. And one particular area, 35 schools had indicated that they were without water storage facilities. And I know that we have moved significantly to ensure that all institutions of learning now are provided. Well, of course, with the exception of those in the danger zone, yeah, but that they are provided with water tanks. And I know that program will continue. So that there are certain things, because water would be very important in the way forward. And not only because of COVID-19, but generally, we have to work towards making our schools resilient so that when there's a disaster, we could, one, move seamlessly to a next stage without having to disrupt the education. And part of that is having the schools in a position where they could transition from shelter to school or school to shelter without any great difficulty. Yes. So, I mean, I don't know, Diane. I really wish I had the answers, but certainly at the present time, the most I could say to that question is that we will be guided by the Ministry of Health with regards to those protocols, whether they be for COVID-19, dengue fever, or what have you.
Well, Minister, I think that's a fair response. It's considering everything that's happening. I think that's a fair response. And as we conclude our time this morning, we're on standby for another program at 9:30.
Yes.
As we conclude this morning, I want to say that we appreciate the work that you and your ministry continue to do in this challenging time. I always like to say it could be worse, but we are grateful and we are thankful of where we are at the time. So all the best to you and your ministry, and you have a platform here at NBC should you need to come back and share any information with the public.
Okay, thank you very much, Diane, and thanks to listeners and viewers.
Our guest on our program, Ian Soufriere, the morning edition, Minister of Education, National Reconciliation, the Honorable Curtis King, via Zoom earlier on in the program, lead scientist monitoring the Soufriere volcano, Professor Richard Robertson. Thank you for paying attention and for viewing and for listening.